This is a brief video explaining the web typography exercise in GDP 113. In this exercise, we're going to make a web font in Adobe Illustrator and then display it in the page that you see here. This is not an exercise in making web pages, although there are a few things about web pages that we'll have to go over to make this work. The name John Lemon that you see in the page above was done in a web font that I created in Adobe Illustrator. Actually, the font is Minion Pro. As you see here, what I did was to take the J and a lowercase f, chop them apart, and put them back together. You can do the same thing if you want, although you don't have to for the exercise. All you have to do is create the characters for your own name. Most of the characters here, the O-H-N-L-E-M-O-N, are simply Minion Pro. I converted them to outlines in Illustrator, ran them through an online font editing program, then used them to create the name you see here in the web page. The first thing that you get for this exercise is a Gmail account with the exercise files uploaded as an attachment. The next thing you get is a GitHub account, something that's required by your web host. And finally, there's BitBalloon, the web host, who will provide us free internet access for this exercise. The website itself has been uploaded to your Gmail account in a zip file called webtypo.com. Inside this folder we have an index.html which contains the website and two folders, CSS and fonts. The CSS folder contains styling and the fonts folder contains the fonts that we are going to create in this exercise. Finally, uploaded as an attachment to your Gmail account is the AI package setup folder. Inside of this folder is a file named setup AI, along with the Minion Pro font in the font subfolder. This font is included in case your version of the Creative Cloud does not recognize the font as it is used in this file. Sometimes when going from one computer to another, the Creative Cloud loses track of the font. Who knows why? You may have noticed this with packaged InDesign documents where you have to find the font when you first open the file out of the package. By the way, if your program does not recognize the Minion Pro font contained in the Setup AI file, you should first try setting the characters in the file to the Minion Pro on your computer. If that fails, then you can install the included font and use that. In any case, you should have access to the file as you see it here. The first thing that you should notice is that the artboard is set at 1000 points tall. This is also true of the font size. Now here's an interesting thing. Every font character exists within a bounding box, pretty much the same kind of thing as the bounding box that you're familiar with in the various graphics programs. In this case, we're going to have a bounding box 1000 units tall. I say units even though we have set the height of our artboard at 1000 points because a font does not have a size. Size is assigned by a font rendering program such as InDesign. The height is fixed, but the width varies and is the sum of three variable components: the left side bearing, the character width, and the right side bearing. Side bearing is the amount of blank space between the character and the bounding box. Looking at the left-hand side of our file, we see the pipe character, which in a font should usually extend the entire height of the character. It's that thin vertical line. We're going to use this character in our exercise to avoid sizing problems. The character will always start at 0 height and extend upward to the 1000 unit height. We will then export each character to the font editor containing the pipe. After the character has been placed, we will delete the pipe character. This method is not absolutely necessary, but we are using it because our font editor is unfamiliar to you. If you want to ride bareback, you can just remove it. Just be certain of your metrics when you're editing the character. Interesting also, in the same regard, the underscore character should have no side bearing so that it forms a continuous line. Shown at the top here is the underscore character, and then this is 3 lines of the pipe character at 12 on 12. The pipe character, by the way, is an obscure glyph sometimes used as a footnote denotation. it has gained currency as a programmer's character. Another thing to note is the ruler guide shown here. We have the cap height, the X height, the descender line, and the ascender line. These rule lines will not carry over to the files that we export to the font editor. Those exports will be SVG files. At this point, we're ready to start in on our font, which brings up another interesting point. If I use Minion Pro, am I stealing the font from Adobe? Actually, in the very narrow case of the font that we're creating, I am. This is because I'm taking the vectors from the Adobe font and appropriating them into my new font. That is one of the two things you can't do. The other thing is that you can't call your font Minion Pro. But you could take the idealized forms of the font as raw artwork, draw out each character in Illustrator, just to rub it in Adobe's face, and then create a new font from that. You could call it Sycophant, sort of related to Minion, but not the same thing, and it would be perfectly legal. You can own the rights to the electronic files that constitute the face, and you can own the name of the face, but you cannot own the idealized forms that constitute the face. So pour chocolate over it, and you can make your own sundae. And here's the cherry on top. This only applies to the USA. Cross the Trump wall into the rest of the world, and the whole different set of rules apply. So much for that. Now back to stealing the glyphs. Here I have saved the file into a new name. You will want to have a naming convention. For our purposes, I have selected capv.ai. So now I'll select the characters, leaving the pipe character in place, and enter my first letter. Next, I'll select the character and create outlines. And now I'm going to combine it with the pipe character. And make a compound path. Okay, I'm going to have to change the pipe character to a vector. Now I will combine them. And by the way, if you have anything like a lowercase a, when you convert it, you want to be sure to ungroup and then combine it. Like so. Otherwise, when you drag it around in the font editor, you'll find that you leave the counter behind when you drag the rest of the letter. Now, this may only apply to the font editor that we're using. A different drawing program and a different font editor may have different requirements. So finally, I'm going to bring the artboard in just to tidy this up. The font editor itself will set its side bearings metrically, so it doesn't really matter how much space we have on either side of the letter. And so that just leaves exporting this to SVG. Select SVG and save it. Accept the defaults. And we're ready to go. Our character is ready to upload to the font editor, but first let's take a quick peek at what we've made. Here we have our capv.svg file open in Dreamweaver. As you can see, our SVG file is just text, and it's in a special format called markup. You may recall the term markup from InDesign markup language, IDML, files in InDesign. Markup is a specific format for a text file in which both the content and the display instructions are contained within the same file. These functions may be separated into a series of files, all of which are brought together to display the content portion of a file on a monitor. The display instruction part of the markup is contained within tags shown here in blue with distinctive angle brackets. Later on in our exercise, we will be dealing with another form of markup called HTML, which houses the web page that we are creating to show off our new web font. In the case of our SVG file here, the content portion is actually contained within the display portion because as an image file, the content and the display are the same thing. In our HTML file, we will encounter content that is separate from the display. And this is pretty much what constitutes the image portion, describing the pipe character and the V character. And just to wrap up, let's take a look at how this appears in the browser. So this is our markup file, and this is how it looks. It's interesting, if you look here on the left, you'll see that our rule lines show up as little tick marks. If we were to open this in Illustrator or in our font editor, you wouldn't see those tick marks. The important thing to note here, though, is that the browser is interpreting our SVG file exactly as we created it in Illustrator. Now we get to the heart of our exercise, the font editor. For this part, we will be using a browser-based editor called Glypher. The fact that it is browser-based is very important. Think about this. Here we have a program contained entirely in the browser. Nothing to download, nothing to configure, and nothing to pay. One thing that I should note is the fact that at the time of this recording, this is beta software. One of the things lacking in this version is the ability to include kerning tables in the fonts that we create. But that feature is in the pipeline. We're going to pause here before we open Glypher to consider the implications of this. You may have noticed in InDesign that you have the choice between optical and metric kerning. Let's explore this. Here we have two sets of letters. The first is JO in the John Lemon font that I made when I was setting all this stuff up. Beside it is JO in Minion Pro. Notice that the first pair is slightly larger than the second, even though both are set at 1,000 points. This is because I didn't know what I was doing at the time and I made the characters too large. Another thing that I did was to make the side bearings on the right-hand side of the slash J too narrow. Now watch as I switch between optical and metric kerning. Metric, optical. And now on the JO in Minion Pro. Metric, optical. Metric, optical. Not as profound a difference as between the first two. The reason for the difference between optical and metric kerning is that optical kerning analyzes the shapes of the characters and then applies a formula to achieve the kerning values. With metric kerning, you get what you get. No tables, no kerning. In the case of the John Lemon font here, the differences are enormous. It's difficult to say what's going on with the Minion Pro because, as far as I know, Adobe doesn't have a way to call out these values. Kerning tables may exist, they may not. Here's how this works. If InDesign is using metric kerning, but no kerning tables exist, it will default to using the side bearings of the characters, or else to that along with some arbitrary value that it includes. No universal rules govern this. The way that this is done is entirely up to the software developer of the rendering engine. I'm assuming that in the case of InDesign, the side bearings define the kerning values because the underlines shown here touch with metric but are gapped with optical. Optical, metric. They're touching. I'm not really certain of what's going on here. So for now, we're just talking about underlying concepts. This is why many people have the mistaken idea that optical kerning is superior to metric. What is actually going on is that most fonts created today have no kerning tables, which can take thousands of hours to make. So optical kerning does a pretty good job, especially in the absence of kerning tables, but it does not do a better job than carefully crafted kerning tables.